Picture this, it is a warm June evening in 1957, and a young couple named Frank and Dorothy Miller are sitting in their brand new Chevrolet Bel Air, parked at the end of a street that just a year ago was a cornfield. They are looking at a house. Not a grand house, not a mansion, but a modest four-room Cape Cod with a pitched roof, a chimney, and a patch of grass out front. The house is part of a development called Levittown, but this is not the original Levittown on Long Island. This is a second Levittown, built in Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. Frank works in the city at a printing plant downtown. Dorothy stays home with their two small children. The commute, Frank has been told, will take about 35 minutes each way, thanks to a new highway that is not quite finished yet. That highway is the Pennsylvania Turnpike, but more importantly, it is about to be connected to a brand new system of roads that will change everything. Frank and Dorothy sign the papers, and they become part of the largest migration in American history. They are the first wave of what would become the suburban nation. And the highway that carried them, there was not just a road. It was a promise, a machine, and a revolution all rolled into concrete and asphalt. This is the story of the highway that built the American suburbs. To understand how a single family ended up in that Pennsylvania cornfield, we have to go back a few years, to a time when the United States was still a country of city dwellers and farmers. In 1945, when World War II ended, millions of soldiers came home. They married. They started families, and they needed places to live. The cities were crowded, aging, and expensive. The rental apartments were tiny. The tenements were old. The dream of a single-family home with a yard seemed impossible for most working-class families. But then something extraordinary happened. The federal government decided to build a national network of highways. It was not an obvious decision. There had been highways before, like Route 66 and the Lincoln Highway, but those were scenic roads, 2 lanes, often winding through towns. What the government planned in 1956 was something entirely different. They called it the Interstate Highway System. It would be a web of multi-lane, divided limited-access roads, designed to let cars travel at high speeds from coast to coast, without stopping for traffic lights or crossroads. The official name was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It was signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on June 29th of that year. Eisenhower knew the power of roads. He had seen the German Autobahn network during the war, and he believed that a similar system in America would be vital for national defense, for commerce, and for the movement of people. But what he probably did not fully anticipate was that his highways would become the single most powerful engine for building suburbs. The interstate highway system was funded by a new tax on gasoline, and it was designed to be a network of roads that connected every major city in the country. But the key to the suburban story lies not in the long, open stretches between cities, but in what happened at the edges of those cities. Every interstate highway had interchanges, ramps that led off the high-speed road and into the countryside. And around those interchanges, land that had been farmland or forest suddenly became prime real estate. Developers like William Levitt, the man behind Levittown, understood this before almost anyone else. Levitt had already built one massive suburb on Long Island in the late 1940s, using mass production techniques to build thousands of identical houses quickly and cheaply. That first Levittown was a success, but it was built near existing roads and rail lines. When the Interstate Highway Act passed, Levitt saw an opportunity. He bought huge tracts of land in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and elsewhere, all located within a few miles of where new interstate interchanges would be built. He knew that if you give a family a cheap house and a fast road to the city, they will buy it. And they did. The highway did not just make it possible to live farther from work. It also made it affordable. Before the interstates, commuting by car was slow and expensive. You had to stop at every intersection. You had to deal with traffic jams through small towns. You had to pay for gas and wear and tear on your car. The interstates changed the math. A 30-mile commute that used to take an hour and a half on winding 2-lane roads could now be done in 30 minutes on an interstate. That meant that a family could buy a much larger, cheaper house 30 miles out than they could afford 5 miles from downtown. And because the government was paying for the highways, the cost of the road itself did not fall on the homebuyer. They just paid for the gas tax, which was small. So the highway effectively subsidized the suburbs. Every time the government built a new interchange, it created a new ring of potential suburbs. And the developers were ready. By 1960, just 4 years after the Interstate Highway Act, the first wave of suburban development was in full swing. Communities like Park Forest in Illinois, Lakewood in California, and Levittown in Pennsylvania were sprouting up around the new roads. The pattern was always the same. a new interstate exit, then a cluster of housing developments, then a shopping center, then more housing. The highway became the spine of the suburb. Everything else grew around it, and this was not just about houses. It was about a whole new way of life. The suburbs were designed for the automobile. Houses had driveways and garages. Streets were wide and curved, not grid-like as in cities. There were no sidewalks in many places because nobody walked. Everything was reachable by car. The supermarket, the school, the church, the movie theater all had big parking lots. The highway was the lifeline that connected the suburban home to the downtown job, but it also made it possible for new jobs to move to the suburbs themselves. Factories and offices began to relocate to areas near interstate interchanges, where land was cheap and there was plenty of parking. So by the 1970s, you did not even need to go into the city for work. The highway had created a whole new economy. But the highway that built the suburbs also had a dark side. It destroyed the cities. When the interstates were built, they often cut through existing urban neighborhoods, especially poor and minority communities. In city after city, highways were routed through black and immigrant areas, displacing tens of thousands of families. In some cases, the highways were deliberately used as tools of segregation. They became barriers between white suburbs and black inner cities. The construction of I-95 through the Bronx in New York City, of I-10 through East Los Angeles, of I-65 through Indianapolis all tore apart communities that had existed for generations. And the suburbs themselves were often closed to people of color. Many suburban developments, including Levittown, had restrictive covenants that explicitly barred black families from buying homes. The Federal Housing Administration, which provided mortgage insurance, often refused to guarantee loans in integrated neighborhoods. So while millions of white families moved to the suburbs on the new highways, African American families were left behind in cities that were losing jobs, population, and tax revenue. The highway built the suburbs, but it also built the ghettos. Even so, the suburban dream was powerful. By 1970, more Americans lived in suburbs than in cities or rural areas combined for the first time in the nation's history. The highway made that possible, and the highway itself became a symbol of freedom and mobility. There is a famous photograph from the 1950s of a family in a station wagon, driving on a new interstate, with the father at the wheel, the mother smiling, the kids in the back seat, all of them heading toward a new house in a new subdivision. That image was repeated millions of times, and it was not just an American phenomenon. Countries around the world looked at the American interstate system and built their own highways and their own suburbs, but the United States was the pioneer. We were the first to fully embrace the idea that a road could reshape a nation. To understand just how fast this transformation happened, consider the numbers. In 1956, when the Interstate Highway Act was passed, the United States had about 60,000 miles of paved roads, most of them 2 lanes. By 1970, the interstate system had built over 40,000 miles of multi-lane highways. During that same period, the population of suburbs doubled. The number of cars on the road tripled, and the amount of land devoted to housing, shopping, and offices in the countryside exploded. It was the biggest building boom in American history, and the highway was the engine. Now let us go back to Frank and Dorothy Miller in that Pennsylvania Levittown. They moved into their house in the summer of 1958. The highway they used was part of a new interstate link, I-276, the Pennsylvania Turnpike extension. Every morning, Frank would get into his Chevrolet, back out of the driveway, drive through the winding streets of the development, and turn onto a feeder road that led to the interchange. He would merge onto the interstate, accelerate to 65 miles per hour, and zoom past farms and forests that were already being turned into more subdivisions. In less than 30 minutes, he was at his exit near downtown Philadelphia. He would then drive through the old, narrow streets of the city, park in a lot, and walk to his job. The contrast was stark. The suburbs were clean, quiet, and orderly. The city was crowded, dirty, and noisy. Frank loved his commute. He felt like he was escaping the city every evening and returning to a peaceful oasis. But he never thought about the people who could not escape, the people who lived in the neighborhoods that the highway had cut through, the people who had lost their homes. The people who could not afford a car. For them, the highway was not a path to paradise. It was a wall. That is the paradox of the highway that built the American suburbs. It gave millions of people a better life, or at least a life they thought was better. It gave them space, privacy, and a sense of ownership. It gave them clean air and green lawns, but it also took away the vitality of the city. It drained the lifeblood from downtowns. It created a dependence on oil, on cars, on constant expansion. and it did so without any master plan, without any consideration of the long-term consequences. The highway was built as a solution to a problem, how to move people and goods quickly, but it created a whole new set of problems that we are still grappling with today. In the next part of our story, we will look at how the highway that built the suburbs also remade the American landscape in ways that were both wonderful and terrible. We will travel to different cities across the country and see how each interstate interchange spawned a new community. We will hear from the people who lived through that transformation and from the people who lost everything in its path. And we will ask the question that still haunts us: could we have built the suburbs without the highway? Or was the highway the only way to achieve the dream of a home of your own? But that is for later. For now, imagine yourself sitting behind the wheel of a 1959 Edsel, cruising down a brand new interstate, with the windows down, the radio playing, and the whole world ahead of you. You are headed toward a future that is being paved, mile by mile, with concrete and asphalt. You are part of the highway that built the American suburbs, and you have no idea where it will take you. The highway you are driving on, that ribbon of concrete stretching toward the horizon, is not just a road. It is a promise and a threat. In those early years of the interstate system, the promise seemed overwhelming. For the families streaming out of the cities, the highway offered escape from crowding, from noise, from the grime of industrial America. But what they did not see was the cost of that escape. The highway was not a neutral piece of infrastructure. It was a force that reshaped the land, the economy, and the very idea of community. And it did so with a speed that left little time for reflection. Take Detroit, for example. In the 1950s, Detroit was the fourth largest city in the United States, a thriving industrial powerhouse. Its downtown was a vibrant hub of department stores, theaters, and restaurants. People lived in dense neighborhoods of brick houses and apartment buildings, walking to streetcars and buses. But then came the interstates. I-75, I-94, and I-96 were carved through the heart of the city. They ripped apart neighborhoods like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, historically black enclaves that had been centers of culture and commerce. The highways were built right through them, displacing tens of thousands of residents. The goal was to connect the suburbs to the downtown core, but the effect was to bleed the life out of the city. By the 1970s, Detroit's downtown was hollowed out. The department stores closed. The theaters became parking lots. The streetcars were ripped up. The people who could afford to move had already left, driving out on those same interstates to new subdivisions in Warren, Dearborn, and Southfield, and those suburbs boomed. New shopping centers rose at every interchange. The Northland Mall, one of the first indoor malls in the country, opened in 1954 just off the new highway. It became a destination for suburban families who no longer needed to go downtown. The highway had made the city obsolete for them, and it was not just Detroit. The same story played out in city after city. In Los Angeles, the freeway system was built to connect the vast, sprawling region, but it also destroyed the streetcar network that had once been the envy of the world. The Pacific Electric Railway, the famous red cars, carried millions of people around the basin. But as the freeways were built, the streetcars became inconvenient, then unprofitable, then extinct. By the 1960s, the red cars were gone, replaced by buses that crawled through traffic. The irony was that the freeways, built to solve congestion, only created more of it. The more lanes you added, the more people drove. And the more they drove, the more they needed to expand the freeways. It was a vicious cycle that would come to define American life. But let us go back to that family in the station wagon. They are not just driving to a new house. They are driving to a new way of living. That house in the suburbs, with its two-car garage and its lawn, was not just a shelter. It was a statement. It said that you had made it, that you had achieved the American dream. And that dream was powered by two things: the car and the highway. Without the highway, the suburb would have been impossible. The distance between home and work would have been too great, but with the highway, the commute became manageable. And for a generation of Americans, that commute became a ritual. The morning drive, the evening drive, the weekend trip to the mall, the family vacation to the national park. All of it depended on the interstate, and the interstate in turn depended on the car. By the 1960s, the automobile industry was the largest in the country. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were the titans of American capitalism. They manufactured not just cars, but also the desire for them. Advertising celebrated the freedom of the open road, the thrill of the long drive. And the roads themselves were being built by the government, with tax dollars that came from everyone, including people who could not afford a car. That was a subtle but important fact. The interstate system was paid for by a gas tax, but that tax was regressive. It hit low-income drivers hardest, and it forced non-drivers to subsidize a system they could not use. The poor, the elderly, the disabled, the young, all of them were left behind. The highway was a public investment that primarily benefited the middle class, and it reshaped the geography of opportunity in ways that still echo today. Consider the suburbs themselves. They were not just places to live, they were machines for sorting people by income, by race, by lifestyle. The highway made that sorting possible. In the early years, most suburbs were white and middle class, but as the system expanded, new rings of suburbs appeared farther out, creating a hierarchy of affluence. The inner suburbs, built closest to the city, eventually aged and declined. The outer suburbs, the exurbs, became the new frontier, and this pattern repeated with each new highway interchange. The farther you could drive, the more land you could develop, and the more land you developed, the more you needed even longer commutes. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of sprawl, and sprawl had consequences. It consumed farmland and forests at an astonishing rate. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States was losing about 1 million acres of farmland per year to development, much of it along the interstate corridors. The landscapes that Frank Miller drove past on his way to Philadelphia, the farms and forests, were rapidly being replaced by subdivisions and shopping centers. The highway enabled that transformation, but it also transformed the highway itself. What had once been a scenic drive through open country became a corridor of strip malls and gas stations. The exits sprouted billboards and franchise restaurants. The highway became a place of commerce, not just movement. And then there was the environmental toll. Every mile of interstate required an enormous amount of concrete and asphalt. It required clearing land, rerouting rivers, and reshaping hills. The cars that drove on those highways produced smog and carbon dioxide. The suburbs they served consumed vast amounts of energy for heating, cooling, and transportation. By the 1970s, Americans were using more energy per capita than any other nation on Earth, and a large part of that was directly linked to the highway and the suburban lifestyle. But at the time, few people thought about it. The highway was progress. The suburb was the future. Yet even in the midst of this transformation, there were voices of dissent. Jane Jacobs, a writer and activist, became famous for her fight against the highways that threatened Greenwich Village in New York City. In 1961, she published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a passionate defense of dense, mixed-use neighborhoods. She argued that the highway engineers and urban planners were destroying the very fabric of city life. She fought against the proposed Lower Manhattan Expressway, a highway that would have cut through Soho and Little Italy, and she won. Her activism helped stop the project, but she was the exception. Most cities welcomed the interstate dollars. They did not realize, as Jacobs did, that a highway was not just a road, it was a tool that could kill a city. And kill them it did. By the late 1970s, many American downtowns were in crisis. Retail sales had plummeted, property values had fallen, crime had risen, the middle class had fled. The highways had made it possible for people to live in the suburbs and work in the city, but they had also made it easy for businesses to leave the city. And many did. Corporate headquarters moved to office parks near the interstates, surrounded by parking lots. The downtown skyscraper, once a symbol of urban power, became a relic. The new symbol was the suburban campus, like the ones built by IBM, Sears, and other corporations in places like Schaumburg, Illinois, and Plano, Texas. All of them were connected to the interstate. All of them were part of the same machine. But the machine was not without its glitches. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 exposed the vulnerability of the highway system. When gas prices spiked, suburban commuters were hit hard. The long drives that had once felt liberating became a burden, and the suburbs themselves, designed for the car, were suddenly less attractive. If you could not afford to drive, you could not get to work, to the store, to school. The American dream, it turned out, required a full tank of gas, and the highways required constant maintenance. By the 1980s, many interstates were aging, cracking, and crumbling. The concrete that had been laid in the 1950s was reaching the end of its lifespan. The cost of repair was staggering, and the traffic congestion, once unthinkable, became a daily reality. The solution for decades was to build more lanes, but that only made the problem worse. Meanwhile, the social costs of the highway continued to mount. The neighborhoods that had been cut through, the families that had been displaced, the communities that had been divided, all of them were still living with the consequences. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new movement arose to tear down some of the urban highways and replace them with boulevards or parks. Cities like San Francisco, Milwaukee, and Portland began removing elevated freeways that had blighted their downtowns. In Seoul, South Korea, the Chingyecheon River, which had been covered by a highway, was restored and became a beloved public space. But in the United States, the highway system was so deeply embedded that removing it was nearly impossible. The highways had become the skeleton of the metropolitan region. Without them, the body would collapse, and so we live with the paradox. The highway that built the American suburbs also built the problems we face today: climate change, inequality, segregation, and a nation addicted to oil. The dream of the 1950s, that vision of a house in the suburbs and a car in the garage, has become a nightmare for many. But it is not a nightmare that everyone wants to wake from. There are still millions of Americans who love their suburban homes, who love the open road, who cannot imagine living any other way. The highway remains a symbol of freedom, even as it constrains our choices. Let us return to Frank and Dorothy Miller, now in their old age. They lived in that Levittown house for over 40 years. They raised 2 children there. They watched the highway expand from 2 lanes to 6. They saw the farmland disappear, replaced by strip malls and big box stores. They saw the city of Philadelphia decline and then in recent years begin a slow revival. But they never moved. Frank retired from his job at the accounting firm and started driving less. Dorothy could not drive after a stroke. The highway that had once been their lifeline became a barrier. They could not cross it to visit the park on the other side because there was no crosswalk. They could not walk to the store because the streets had no sidewalks. They depended on their children to drive them to the doctor, the supermarket, the pharmacy. The dream of independence had turned into a prison of dependence, and that is the final irony. The highway that built the American suburbs, the road that was supposed to set us free, has locked us into a way of life that is difficult to change. We built our homes too far apart, our roads too wide, our communities too spread out. We designed a world that requires a car for every trip, no matter how short, and now we are stuck with it. We cannot easily rebuild our cities and suburbs. We cannot easily undo the damage. But we can look back at the choices we made and we can ask ourselves, what would we do differently? Could we have built a different kind of suburb, one that was connected by trains and buses, one that had sidewalks and corner stores, one that did not depend on the highway? Perhaps, but we did not. We chose the highway, and it chose us. The story of the highway that built the American suburbs is not over. It continues every day, with every new car that merges onto the interstate, with every new subdivision that rises near an exit ramp, with every new mile of concrete that stretches across the landscape. The highway is still building the suburbs, and the suburbs are still building the highway. It is a cycle that seems almost impossible to break, but understanding how it began is the first step to imagining a different ending. Understanding how it began is the first step to imagining a different ending. And yet, imagining is not the same as building. For every city that has tried to undo the damage of the interstate, there are a dozen more that are doubling down, widening lanes, adding new interchanges, pouring more concrete into the bloodstream of the nation. The highway that built the American suburbs is still under construction, and the story of its creation is not just a history lesson. It is a map of our present, a guide to the forces that still shape where we live, how we move, and who we become. Consider the case of Atlanta. No city in America embraced the interstate more fully or more recklessly. In the 1950s, Atlanta was a modest southern city, a regional hub for trade and transportation. Its leaders saw the interstate system as a way to leapfrog into national prominence. They built a web of highways that sliced through the heart of the city, connecting downtown to a growing ring of suburbs. The result was explosive growth. Atlanta became the economic capital of the Southeast, a magnet for corporations and migrants. But the highways also carved the city into fragments. The neighborhoods that were cut by the interstates, black neighborhoods primarily, were devastated. The Sweet Auburn district, once a thriving center of black commerce and culture, was bifurcated by the construction of Interstate 75 and 8 Five. Homes were demolished, businesses shuttered, and the community's cohesion was shattered. The highway was supposed to bring progress, but for many, it brought only displacement and decay. By the 1990s, Atlanta had become a poster child for sprawl. The metropolitan area stretched across dozens of counties, connected by a lattice of interstates and arterial roads. Commuters spent hours in traffic, stuck in what was routinely called the longest commute in America. The air quality deteriorated, and the city earned the dubious distinction of having some of the worst smog in the nation. And yet the growth did not stop. New subdivisions sprouted along every new exit ramp, each one farther from the urban core. The highway was the engine, and it had no reverse gear. Atlanta's story is extreme, but it is not unique. From Dallas to Denver, from Phoenix to Minneapolis, the pattern repeated. The interstate highway became the backbone of metropolitan expansion, and the suburbs became its ribs, but the ribs were not attached to a heart. The downtowns that remained were often hollowed out, their vitality drained by the very roads that were supposed to bring them life. The shopping centers and office parks that lined the interstates became the new town squares, but they were not places of community. They were places of transaction, designed to be entered and exited by car. The sidewalks that did exist were ornamental, leading nowhere. The benches were scarce. The only sound was the hum of tires on asphalt. And yet, even in the heart of this car-centric landscape, there were countercurrents. In the 1970s, a new generation of urban planners began to question the assumptions of the highway age. They looked at the work of Jane Jacobs and realized that she had been right all along. They studied the neighborhoods that had survived the interstate era relatively unscathed, places like Georgetown in Washington, D.C., or the French Quarter in New Orleans, and saw that they thrived because they were walkable, mixed-use, and human-scaled. They began to advocate for a different kind of development, one that prioritized people over cars. This movement eventually became known as New Urbanism, and it produced some notable successes. Seaside, Florida, a planned community built in the 1980s, became a model for pedestrian-friendly design. Its narrow streets, front porches, and town center were a direct rebuke to the sprawling subdivisions of the post-war era. But Seaside was a boutique experiment, a wealthy enclave for the few. The real challenge was to retrofit the existing suburbs, to transform the endless cul-de-sacs and six-lane arterials into places that could support life without a car. And that was, and remains, extraordinarily difficult. The physical infrastructure of suburbia, the wide roads, the large lots, the separated uses, was built to last. Changing it would require tearing it down and starting over, which is prohibitively expensive and politically unpopular. So instead, most cities have tried to add a few bike lanes here, a bus rapid transit line there, hoping to nudge the system in a different direction. But the highway remains the dominant force, and its inertia is immense. There is another dimension to this story that we have not yet fully explored, the role of the federal government in shaping not just the roads, but the housing market. The interstate highway system was built with a purpose that went beyond transportation. It was also a tool for urban renewal, which was often a euphemism for the destruction of poor and minority neighborhoods. The highways were deliberately routed through areas that were considered blighted, clearing land for new development, and in many cases, for new highways that would serve the white suburbs. This was not a side effect, it was policy. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 required that interstate funds be used to build roads that promote the efficient movement of traffic, but it also encouraged the removal of slums and the redevelopment of obsolete areas. In practice, this meant that the interstates became a tool of racial segregation, reinforcing the lines of division that had long existed in American cities. Consider the construction of Interstate 94 in Minneapolis. The highway cut through the near North Side, a predominantly African-American neighborhood. According to the Minnesota Historical Society, the highway displaced over 600 families and destroyed dozens of businesses. The neighborhood never recovered. Today, the area is still marked by poverty, unemployment, and disinvestment. The highway acts as a physical barrier, separating the black community from the rest of the city. It is a concrete wall, built with federal dollars, that continues to enforce segregation decades after the last surveyor left. The same story played out in cities across the country. In Miami, Interstate 95 devoured the Overtown neighborhood, once known as the Harlem of the South. In New Orleans, Interstate 10 bulldozed through the Treme, one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods in the nation. In Chicago, the Dan Ryan Expressway cut through the Bronzeville neighborhood, displacing thousands. The highway was never just a road. It was a weapon, wielded by planners and politicians who saw the city not as a living organism, but as a machine to be optimized. And the parts that were deemed inefficient or undesirable were simply removed. This legacy of destruction has created a deep and enduring distrust of infrastructure projects in many communities. When a new highway or a highway widening is proposed today, it is often met with fierce opposition from residents who remember the past. They know that the highway does not just bring cars, it brings change, and often that change is not for the better. They have seen the property values drop, the noise increase, the air quality worsen. They have watched their neighbors move away, their schools decline, their streets become less safe. The highway, they understand, is a thief in the night, and it steals everything in its path, and yet the highway lobby remains powerful. The American Road and Transportation Builders Association, the American Automobile Association, and the trucking industry have all fought fiercely to protect and expand the interstate system. They argue that highways are essential for economic growth, for national security, for the American way of life. They point to the millions of jobs that depend on the transportation of goods and people. They remind us that the interstate highway system is one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, and that it has brought unprecedented mobility and prosperity to the nation. All of that is true, but it is not the whole truth. The highway has also brought pollution, congestion, sprawl, and social division. It has made us richer in some ways and poorer in others. Perhaps the most profound change wrought by the interstate system is the way it has reshaped our sense of time and space. Before the interstate, distance was measured in hours, not minutes. A trip from New York to Chicago took days. The interstate collapsed those distances, making it possible to drive from coast to coast in a matter of days. But it also created a new kind of geography, one in which places became interchangeable. The same fast food restaurants, the same gas stations, the same motels appeared at every exit. The landscape became homogenized, stripped of local character. The road itself became the destination, and the places along it became mere waypoints. This is the paradox of the highway. It connects us, but it also erases the differences that make places unique. It brings us closer together, but it also isolates us in our cars. It offers freedom, but it also creates dependence. And now, as we face the twin crises of climate change and social inequality, we are being forced to reckon with the consequences of our choices. The highway that built the American suburbs is also the highway that is strangling them. There is a growing movement to reclaim the streets from the car. In cities like Paris, London, and Copenhagen, mayors have implemented ambitious plans to reduce car traffic, expand public transit, and create pedestrian-friendly spaces. In the United States, some cities are following suit. New York has closed parts of Broadway to cars, creating pedestrian plazas in Times Square and Herald Square. San Francisco has converted a stretch of the Embarcadero, once an elevated freeway, into a boulevard with streetcars and bike lanes. Seattle has built a light rail system that connects the suburbs to the city center, offering an alternative to the highway. But these efforts are still small compared to the scale of the problem. The highway system is not going away. It is too deeply embedded in the fabric of our lives, too thoroughly integrated into our economy and our culture. What we can do, however, is to change the way we think about it. We can stop treating the highway as the default solution to every transportation problem. We can start investing in alternatives, trains, buses, bike lanes, sidewalks that give people a real choice. And we can begin to heal the wounds that the highway has inflicted on our cities and our communities. Frank and Dorothy Miller are long gone now. Their Levittown house has passed through several owners, been renovated, expanded, and sold again. The highway that once defined their world is still there, carrying more cars than ever, but the neighborhood around it has changed. Some of the older residents have moved away, replaced by new immigrants from Asia and Latin America. The shopping centers that were built in the 1960s are now struggling, as e-commerce has siphoned away their customers. The big box stores are closing, leaving empty shelves and vast parking lots. The highway, once a symbol of progress, is now a relic of a bygone era. And yet, it still hums with traffic, day and night, carrying people from one place to another, carrying the dreams and frustrations of a nation that cannot seem to let go of its love affair with the automobile. The story of the highway that built the American suburbs is not just a story of concrete and steel. It is a story of choices, of values, of the kind of world we want to live in. It is a story of power and money, of race and class, of hope and disappointment. It is a story that is still being written every day on every mile of road, and the ending is not yet determined. We have the power to choose differently. We have the wisdom to learn from our mistakes. We have the courage to imagine a different future. But first, we must understand the past, and that is what this story has been about. The highway that built the American suburbs is still here, and it will remain here for decades to come. But the suburbs themselves are changing. They are becoming more diverse, more dense, more connected. The single-family home on a quarter-acre lot is no longer the only dream. Young people are moving back to cities or to older suburbs that have walkable downtowns. They are demanding transit, bike lanes, and more public space. They are rejecting the car-centric lifestyle of their parents and grandparents. The highway is no longer the hero of their story. Perhaps the most telling sign of this shift is the rise of the so-called streetcar suburb, a term that describes neighborhoods built before the automobile, when streetcars and trains defined the shape of the city. These neighborhoods, places like Brookline, Massachusetts, or Oak Park, Illinois, are now among the most desirable places to live in America. They offer walkable streets, historic homes, and easy access to transit. They are the antithesis of the highway suburb. And yet they are also a reminder that we have been here before. Before the interstate, before the suburbs, there was another vision of the American dream, one that was built around community, not cars. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, which vision do we want to pursue? Do we keep pouring concrete, widening roads, and building ever farther from the core? Or do we reinvest in our cities, our towns, and our older suburbs, creating places that are connected, sustainable, and human-scaled? The answer is not simple, and it will not come easily, but it is a question that we cannot afford to ignore. The highway that built the American suburbs is a complicated legacy. It gave us mobility, but it also took away our sense of place. It gave us prosperity, but it also created inequality. It gave us freedom, but it also trapped us in a system that is hard to escape. And now, as we stand at the intersection of history and possibility, we have a choice. We can keep driving, or we can stop, look around, and find a different road. The journey is far from over. The journey is far from over, and perhaps that is the most important truth of all. For every mile of asphalt laid down in the name of progress, there is now a counter-inch of resistance, a thread of a different story being woven by people who refuse to accept the highway as the final word. In cities across America, communities are not just dreaming of a different future, they are building it, one block at a time. Take, for instance, the story of the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans. When that elevated highway was driven through the Treme neighborhood in the 1960s, it cleaved one of the oldest African-American communities in the nation. It demolished homes, buried a vibrant commercial corridor, and left a dark, noisy scar that cast a shadow over the streets below. For decades, the people of Treme lived with that shadow, their quality of life worsened by the constant roar of traffic overhead. But they did not forget. They organized, they protested, they dreamed, and in recent years, a movement has emerged to tear the expressway down and replace it with a boulevard, a greenway, a place where people can walk and gather and live. The proposal is controversial, expensive, and uncertain, but it is real. It is a sign that the highway's grip is not unbreakable. In Rochester, New York, a similar struggle is unfolding. The Inner Loop, a sunken highway that once sliced through the city's downtown, is being filled in, stitch by stitch, to reconnect neighborhoods that were separated for generations. The project is not easy. It requires billions of dollars, years of construction, and a willingness to admit that the original design was a mistake. But the results are already visible. New parks, new housing, new streets that invite people to linger instead of speed through. The highway that was meant to bring efficiency to the city had instead brought emptiness. Now, the city is reclaiming its own fabric. It is a slow, painstaking process, but it offers a glimpse of what is possible when a community decides to put people before cars. And then there is the story of the Atlanta Beltline, a 22-mile loop of old railroad tracks that has been transformed into a network of trails, transit, and parks. The Beltline was not built by tearing down highways, but by repurposing what was already there. It connects dozens of neighborhoods, offers a safe path for cyclists and pedestrians, and has sparked a wave of development that prioritizes walkability and public space. It is not a complete solution. Gentrification and rising rents have become painful side effects, but it is a powerful example of how a city can choose a different path. The Beltline was born from a graduate student's thesis, a vision that seemed impossible at first but slowly gained traction through grassroots organizing and political will. Today, it is one of the most ambitious urban redevelopment projects in the country, visited by planners from around the world who want to learn how to build a city that is not dominated by cars. These are not isolated stories. Across the United States, in cities large and small, there is a quiet revolution underway. It is not always visible from the highway. It happens in community meetings, in city council chambers, in the pages of local newspapers, and in the conversations between neighbors. It is driven by people who have grown tired of traffic jams, tired of parking lots, tired of the isolation that comes from being sealed inside a metal box for hours every day. They are demanding sidewalks, bus lanes, bike paths, and safe crosswalks. They are questioning the wisdom of spending billions of dollars to widen roads that will only fill up again with more cars. They are rediscovering the value of the street as a public space, not just a conduit for traffic. Part of this shift is generational. The millennials and Gen Zers who are now entering adulthood grew up with the internet, with climate anxiety, with a deep skepticism of the institutions that built the old suburbs. They have seen their parents and grandparents spend hours commuting, and they do not want that life for themselves. They are more likely to live in cities, to use ride-sharing services, to prefer walking or biking to driving. They are also more likely to value experiences over possessions, to care about sustainability, to support policies that reduce carbon emissions. The car, once a symbol of freedom and adulthood, is becoming a burden for many young people. Car ownership rates among young Americans have been declining for years. The number of young people with driver's licenses has fallen. They are voting with their feet, and their feet are often on the sidewalk, not the accelerator. But the shift is not only generational. It is also economic. The highway suburb, with its sprawling lots and long commutes, is becoming less affordable for many families. The hidden costs of car ownership, insurance, maintenance, fuel, parking, add up to thousands of dollars a year. When gas prices spike, as they did in 2008 and again in 2022, the suburban dream becomes a nightmare for those who have no alternative but to drive. Meanwhile, the cost of housing in walkable neighborhoods has skyrocketed, creating a new form of inequality. The people who can afford to live near transit and amenities are often wealthy, while low-income families are pushed to the far edges of the metropolitan area, where they face long commutes and limited options. The highway that was supposed to democratize mobility has instead created a two-tier system: those who can choose and those who must drive. Environmental advocates have also joined the fight. The interstate highway system, for all its engineering marvels, is a massive contributor to climate change. The United States transportation sector accounts for nearly 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the majority of that comes from cars and trucks. The more we build highways, the more we encourage driving, and the more we lock in a pattern of emissions that will be difficult to break. The solution is not simply to build more electric cars, though that helps, but to reduce the number of miles we drive in the first place. That means creating communities where people do not have to drive for every errand, every trip to school, every visit to a friend. It means investing in public transit, in dense mixed-use neighborhoods, in the kind of infrastructure that makes it easy to leave the car at home. The federal government, which once championed the interstate system, is beginning to change its tune. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included billions of dollars for transit, rail, and pedestrian projects, as well as a program to reconnect communities that were divided by highways. This is a historic shift, but it is only a beginning. The legacy of the interstate system cannot be undone overnight. It will take decades of sustained effort to repair the damage, to rebuild the neighborhoods that were demolished, to create a transportation network that serves everyone, not just drivers. And it will require a fundamental rethinking of what we consider progress. Perhaps the most hopeful sign is the growing awareness that the highway story is not just about engineering. It is about values. It is about who we want to be as a nation. The interstate highway system was built during a time of great confidence in technology, in top-down planning, in the idea that bigger was better. That confidence has been shaken. We now understand that the best solutions are often local, that community input matters, that a road is not just a road, but a place where people live, work, and play. We have learned that the fastest way to get from point A to point B is not always the best way. Sometimes the best journey is the one that lets you stop along the way, that connects you to the landscape and the people around you. And so the highway that built the American suburbs is no longer the hero of the story. It is a character, an important one, but one whose flaws are now visible to all. The suburbs themselves are evolving. The single-family home on a large lot is still the dream for many, but it is no longer the only dream. There are new kinds of suburbs emerging: suburban downtowns with apartment buildings and light rail, greenfield developments built on the principles of new urbanism, older suburbs that are being retrofitted with bike lanes and bus rapid transit. The car will not disappear, but it will no longer be the sole ruler of the road. The future is not one of no cars, but of fewer cars, and of cars that are used differently: shared, electric, automated, and integrated with other modes of travel. In the end, the story of the highway is a story about choices. We chose to build the interstates. We chose to subsidize the suburbs. We chose to prioritize the car above all else. Those choices led to the world we live in today, with all its wonders and all its wounds, but we are not bound by them forever. The highway is a thing of concrete and steel, but it is also a thing of the human mind. It is a creation of our imagination, our values, our priorities. And as we change our imagination, as we change our values, as we change our priorities, we can change the highway. We can tear it down, or we can transform it, or we can build something new alongside it. The path is not fixed. Frank and Dorothy Miller, if they were alive today, would not recognize the debate that is now happening. They would see a world that has moved far beyond their simple dreams of a house and a car and a yard. They would see a generation questioning everything they took for granted. They would see the highway they once marveled at now being criticized, even demolished, and perhaps they would feel a sense of loss, a sense that the world they built is slipping away, but they might also feel a sense of hope. After all, they were pioneers. They were willing to take a risk, to try something new, to imagine a different way of life. That same spirit of imagination is alive today. It is the spirit that drives the advocates, the planners, the activists, the ordinary citizens who refuse to accept the status quo. It is the spirit that says we can do better. The highway that built the American suburbs is still there, humming with traffic, carrying millions of cars every day. But the story is changing. The old certainties are fading and new possibilities are emerging. The journey is far from over, but the road ahead is not the same as the road behind. And that perhaps is the most hopeful truth of all. We are not stuck. We are not trapped. We are moving slowly, fitfully, but undeniably toward a different future. The highway will always be part of our past. It does not have to be the whole of our future. We have the power to choose, and we are choosing to begin again. But what does beginning again look like? It is not a single plan or a single project. It is 1,000 small experiments happening across the country, in cities and suburbs and rural towns, where people are asking the same question: what if we built our communities around people instead of cars? In Portland, Oregon, they tore down a highway along the Willamette River and turned it into a park, and the city did not collapse. In fact, the waterfront became a gathering place, a destination, a symbol of what is possible when we choose to reclaim space from the machine. In Rochester, New York, they removed the Inner Loop Expressway that had strangled downtown for decades and replaced it with a boulevard lined with trees and apartments and shops. The traffic did not disappear, but it slowed down, and the neighborhood came back to life. In Los Angeles, they are ripping out the concrete of the Los Angeles River and restoring it to a natural channel, a place where people can walk and bike and fish, a place that once was nothing but a flood control ditch. These are not easy transformations. They face opposition from those who fear change, from those who believe that the only way to move is fast, from those who have built their lives around the car. But they are happening slowly, one block at a time, and they are spreading. The federal Reconnecting Communities program, which started with a few $1 million and grew to billions in the Infrastructure Act, is now funding dozens of projects across the country. In Detroit, they are studying how to cap the I-375 freeway that splits the historically black neighborhood of Black Bottom. In Syracuse, they are planning to remove the elevated highway that cuts off the city from its lakefront. In Baltimore, they are thinking about how to knit together the neighborhoods that were torn apart by the construction of 8-3. Each of these projects is a small act of repair, a way of acknowledging that the highways of the 20th century were not neutral infrastructure, but instruments of division and displacement. The conversation is no longer just about highways. It is about the whole system of land use and transportation that the highways enabled. The single-family zoning that dominates American suburbs is being challenged, slowly but surely. Cities like Minneapolis and Portland have eliminated single-family zoning entirely, allowing duplexes and triplexes in every neighborhood. States like California and Oregon have passed laws that require cities to plan for more density near transit. The idea is to give people more choices, to allow them to live in places where they can walk to the grocery store, where their children can bike to school, where they can take a train to work. It is not about outlawing the car. It is about making the car one option among many, not the only option. And then there is the quiet revolution of remote work. The pandemic shattered the assumption that everyone must commute to an office every day. Millions of Americans now work from home at least part of the time. That changes everything. If you do not have to drive to work, then the commute becomes optional. The highway's primary purpose, moving workers to central business districts, is suddenly less urgent. The suburbs that were built around the commute are now free to reinvent themselves. Some are becoming hubs of local activity, with coffee shops and co-working spaces and farmers' markets. Others are struggling with empty strip malls and rising crime. The future is not predetermined. It depends on the choices that communities make. The highway itself is not going away. The interstates are too vast, too expensive to remove, too deeply embedded in the economy. But they can be transformed, they can be narrowed, they can be decked over with parks and housing, they can be turned into boulevards with slower speeds and safer crossings. They can be made to work for everyone, not just drivers. The technology of the car is also changing. Electric vehicles are cleaner, but they still require space to park and roads to drive on. Autonomous vehicles might reduce traffic, but they might also encourage more sprawl if they make long commutes even easier. The future is not written. It is being written now by the decisions we make about how we build our communities. Perhaps the most important shift is in the way we think about time. The highway suburb was built on the promise of speed. Get in the car, drive fast, arrive quickly, but speed comes at a cost. The faster we go, the less we see, the less we interact, the less we belong to a place. The new thinking values slowness. It values the walk to the corner store, the chat with a neighbor, the bike ride to the park. It values the kind of urban fabric that is not just a backdrop, but a stage for everyday life. This is not nostalgia. It is a recognition that the old ways, the dense neighborhoods of the pre-war era, were not inefficient but profoundly efficient in a different sense. They wasted less land, less energy, less time. They were more sustainable, more equitable, more human. The highway that built the American suburbs is now being challenged by a new generation that has learned from its mistakes. But that generation is not alone. There are older Americans who remember what it was like before the interstates, who recall the streetcars and the corner stores and the front porches. There are immigrants who never had the car-centric lifestyle and bring different traditions of urban living. There are activists who have been fighting for decades for better transit and safer streets. The movement is broad and growing. It is not a rebellion. It is a rebalancing. And so the story does not end with the highway. It ends with us, with the choices we make every day. Do we get in the car for a 5-minute trip, or do we walk? Do we support a new housing development downtown, or do we fight it? Do we vote for more transit funding, or do we insist on more highway lanes? These are small decisions, but they add up. They shape the world we leave to our children. The highway generation built a world of speed and convenience and solitude. The next generation can build a world of connection and community and care. The road is open. The choice is ours. And that is the hopeful truth at the heart of this story. The highway was built by people, and people can rebuild the world around it. We are not victims of the concrete. We are the ones who poured it, and we are the ones who can break it apart and plant gardens in the cracks. The journey continues, but now we are driving a little slower, looking out the window a little longer, and realizing that the destination is not a house in the suburbs, but a home in a community. That is the new American dream. And it is already taking shape, one street at a time. And yet, for all this hopeful momentum, there is a stubborn truth that cannot be ignored. The highway system is not just concrete and asphalt. It is a way of thinking, a set of assumptions that have been baked into our laws, our financing, our very sense of what a good life looks like. The Federal Housing Administration still guarantees loans for single-family homes in car-dependent subdivisions. The gas tax still funds highway expansion. The zoning codes in most suburbs still forbid anything but detached houses on large lots. Changing those structures is slow, painstaking work. It requires not just new projects, but new habits, new expectations, new norms. It means convincing a suburban homeowner that allowing a duplex next door will not destroy property values. It means persuading a city council that removing a lane of traffic will not cause gridlock. It means proving to a developer that building a walkable neighborhood can be profitable. These battles are being fought in planning meetings and courtrooms and ballot boxes across America. In Arlington, Virginia, a county once defined by suburban sprawl has transformed its metro corridors into dense, mixed-use communities where people can live without cars. In Boulder, Colorado, they have capped growth with an urban growth boundary and invested heavily in bike lanes and buses. In Nashville, a recent transit referendum failed, but the conversation did not end. The supporters regrouped and are trying again with a different plan, a different message. The fight is never over. It is a long game, a generational shift. The most profound change may be happening in the hearts of ordinary people. The pandemic forced millions to stay home, to walk their neighborhoods, to notice the cracks in the sidewalk and the birds in the trees. They rediscovered the pleasure of slowness. They started gardens. They bought bikes. They realized that the commute was not a necessary evil but a choice, and they chose differently. Even as offices reopen, many workers are refusing to go back 5 days a week. The highway rush hour has not returned to pre-pandemic levels in most cities. The car is still king, but its throne is wobbling. What will replace it? Not a single solution, but a mosaic of them. Electric scooters and bike share systems, light rail and bus rapid transit. Car shares and ride-hailing, used wisely, not as a substitute for walking, but as a supplement. The goal is not to eliminate the car, but to break its monopoly, to give people the freedom to choose how they move, where they live, how they spend their time. That freedom is what the highway promised but never delivered. It promised speed but gave us congestion. It promised convenience but gave us isolation. The new vision promises something smaller but more real, a street where children can play, a corner where neighbors meet, a path that leads not away from community but into it. So the highway that built the American suburbs is not the end of the story. It is a chapter, a long and troubled one, but a chapter nonetheless. The next chapter is being written now, in the decisions of planners and politicians, yes, but also in the choices of every person who decides to walk instead of drive, to plant a tree in a parking lot, to fight for a crosswalk, to support a new transit line. The concrete will not vanish overnight, but it can be cracked, and in those cracks, something green can grow. That is the quiet revolution. It is happening everywhere, and it is only just beginning. The road ahead is not a straight line. It is a winding path, full of detours and setbacks, but also full of possibility. We are not lost. We are finding our way home.